Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, back with another video. So, the news just broke that the Demetrius Andrade-Zach Parker fight for the interim WBO title at super middleweight has officially been announced. It's going to be taking place in May in Derby, which is of course where Zach Parker is from. Frank Warren won the purse bid for the fight, defeating Eddie Hearn in the purse bid, and the fight's going to be taking place on BT Sports. So let's talk about this fight. This is a fight I'm thoroughly looking forward to. It's one I find really interesting. So, I've actually spoke about this fight many times over the past year or so. In fact, I think the first time I ever really envisioned this fight happening was about 2 years ago, and I'm sure it was in talks all the way back then for being one that could potentially happen in the future. And I've spoke about the fight on live streams with several people. I've mentioned the fight here and there, and one of the things that I've always pointed out, because one of the narratives going into this fight is that many people feel that the reason why Demetrius Andrade is moving up in weight and is fighting Zach Parker is because he didn't really want to risk fighting his mandatory Janibek, Alan Canuli, at middleweight. A lot of people felt that Demetrius Andrade didn't really fancy that fight, thought it was too big a risk, and that he sees Zach Parker as the easier option. And I've always said from day one that I don't really agree with that. I actually think that if Demetrius Andrade really believes that, if he thinks that Zach Parker is the easier option here, then he's mistaken, and he's making a big mistake because in my personal opinion, Zach Parker is a much better fighter than Janibek, much more proven, much more technically astute, and he's a much bigger guy too. So I'm not saying that Janibek is not a good fighter, he is, but I don't really see anything that Janibek brings to the table that Zach Parker doesn't. So in my opinion, this is a very, very tough fight for Andrade, and I've said for, I think, the past couple of years or so that if this fight does happen, I'll actually be favouring Zach Parker. Now that I hear the fight's taking place in Derby on BT Sports, I'm even more convinced that Parker can win this fight. So let's talk about it. So both of these guys have got a lot in common. Both of them are very tall, very long. Demetrius Andrade, of course, used to fight at 154, and he was absolutely massive. He was a monster at 154. The guy's like 6'1", something like that. He's got very, very long reach. When he used to fight at 154, he was known for his sweet movement and his hand speed, and he was very athletic, very sharp. He was never the most technically gifted fighter, though, in my opinion. I mean, he did have some really tough fights against the likes of Vanes Martirosyan, for example, which many people felt he lost. But he was always a dangerous guy. I remember when he took out Brian Rose, and he had a decent run at 154 as champion. And back then, I think he was closer to his prime. I think he was faster and more athletic, and he had a big size advantage in that division. When he moved up to middleweight, however, I was never overly impressed with Andrade. He looked really limited, in my opinion, when he fought Liam Williams. I thought he really struggled in that fight. He did a lot of holding, a lot of clinching, and there's a particular pattern that you see from Andrade's fights. He looks great early on. Like, I'd say for the first 3 or 4 rounds of a fight early on, he looks very, very good. You know, nice and sharp combinations, moves around the ring, knows how to utilize his reach. But what I've noticed is when an opponent starts to apply pressure and starts to adjust to the speed and the awkward style of Andrade, I've noticed that Andrade kind of falls apart and he starts to fight a little bit like Deontay Wilder, where you see a lot of windmilling, wide punches. And, when he fought, like I mentioned, Liam Williams, he looked great in the early rounds of that fight. He dropped Liam Williams and looked on the verge of stopping him, but once Liam Williams settled down into the fight and realised that Andrade's punches were a little bit predictable, he started to pick up some rounds in that fight, and Andrade just started to wing punches, and he just looked really limited to me, throwing windmills, holding, and just he had to spoil his way through that fight, basically. When of course he fought Jack Koke, I think that fight was actually at 154. That was where most of Andrade's flaws became apparent, because again, he looked great early in that fight, but once Jack Koke managed to start applying pressure and started to adjust to Andrade's style, he started to win a lot of the later rounds and arguably won that fight. That fight could have gone either way, in my opinion. I remember watching that fight live. It was over in Germany, and I was really split on who I thought won at the end of that fight. It was a split decision, and it could have gone either way, in my opinion, but Andrade was able to escape with the win. But ever since that fight, to me, I think his flaws have just become more and more apparent. He did have an impressive win over Jason Quigley, but Jason Quigley is kind of a domestic level fighter from Ireland. He's not really world class, doesn't have great technique and doesn't have great defense, and he took him out quickly. And I've just got to be honest, Demetrius Andrade, to me, yeah, he's talented, yeah, he's technically good, and in the early stages of fights, he's dangerous, but he's never a fighter that I've been overly impressed with. I don't think he's a great 12-round fighter. You know, he doesn't really adjust in fights, in my opinion. And he's just a guy who I've always felt was somewhat beatable and somewhat limited. You know, if you get an opponent who knows how to make adjustments over 12 rounds, a guy who is patient, a guy who's technically astute, I've always felt he was beatable. You know, you guys all that have been following my channel will know that when I did a prediction video for his fight against Billy Joe Saunders, I was actually picking Billy Joe to beat Demetrius Andrade in a close fight. I thought Billy was going to figure him out and outbox him and win on points. And the reason for that is exactly the same as what I've said in this video. Andrade just doesn't really adjust that well late in fights, and he's quite limited in my opinion. In fact, he's very limited when you figure him out. So how do I see this Zach Parker fight? Now, Zach Parker, to me, I've said for a while he's underrated. You know, he's a guy who gets a lot of stick from a lot of boxing fans. People don't really rate him, and I think one of the reasons why people don't rate Zach Parker very much is because a few years back he had a fight against a guy called Darrell Williams, and a lot of people felt that he lost that fight. A lot of people thought he had a gift. Now, despite the fact that most people thought he lost that fight, one of the things that I think people are ignoring about that fight is that I think for 10 rounds or so of that fight, he was fighting with one arm. In the second round, I believe it was, Zach Parker ended up with a pretty serious injury to his left arm. And Zach Parker is an orthodox, a guy who really relies on his jab. So he wasn't able to jab with his left hand for almost the entirety of that fight. So what ended up happening was he switched to southpaw, and he boxed that entire fight using his right hand, just jabbing and moving and throwing counter right hooks. And I actually thought the fight was a lot more competitive than people thought it was. I'm not saying that Zach Parker won the fight, but it was a lot more close and competitive than people were saying. And I actually felt that one of the things that impressed me about the fight was the fact that Zach Parker, despite being in visible distress over his arm, he actually showed pretty good defense in the fight. Darrell Williams is the type of fighter who had a very high volume. You know, he was one of these Mike Tyson type fighters, come forward pressure fighter with his high guard, and he would bob and weave, and he would get inside and work your body and throw lots of hooks and uppercuts. Very fit and very high volume type of fighter. And I'd seen several of his fights too, and he was a guy who was always in your face, just a very high volume fighter. And Zach Parker, to me, actually showed good defense off the ropes. He showed he was able to stand in the pocket at times and dip and bend at the waist, and he was able to kind of roll with shots. And I thought that his defense in that fight, when you consider the circumstances, was actually really good. And he showed a pretty good right jab from a southpaw stance. He was landing the right hook quite a lot in the fight too. And I thought he boxed very well in that fight. And I thought it was a very close fight. And I don't think it was as one-sided as people were saying. And I felt that Zach Parker showed a good chin in the fight too. And he showed good mental toughness in that fight. So I really don't think that fight is worth really writing Zach Parker off. I think if anything, it showed what he was made of. You know, he escaped with the victory, controversially, but he was able to come back from that fight. And you know, Darrell Williams, I don't think he's even fought since. I think he retired. Whereas Zach Parker's gone on to have several knockout victories. You know, he beat the likes of Rohan Murdoch, who was a tough fringe contender. He knocked him out in the 11th after a good fight, showing that he has good power late in fights and good stamina. He also knocked out Von Alexander. And I just feel as if Zach Parker, to me, has really come of age now. You know, he's pretty much at his prime. and he's improving fight by fight, whereas Andrade seems to have regressed a little bit, in my opinion. So it's a really good fight. Zach Parker has shown too, in my opinion, that he can box on the outside consistently for 12 rounds. You know, he's not a guy who will be winning early on, and then when you put the pressure on him, he'll start to fall apart. You know, I've not really seen that from Zach Parker. So I think this is a good fight. And I make Zach Parker a favourite for this fight. I think he's going to beat Demetrius Andrade. I don't think he's going to stop Andrade. I think Andrade, one of the things I will credit with him with is that he knows how to survive. You know, if he gets hurt or dropped in a fight, he strikes me as the type of fighter who will know how to go in his shell or survive and spoil and smother your work and hold and lean and just speculate punches from the outside and manage to just old man his way through the fight. I think he will be able to go the distance, and I do think in the early rounds he is dangerous. And I think that Zach Parker is going to have to be careful, because one of the things I will say about Zach Parker is he does get hit. You know, he doesn't have the... I mean, he has good defense and he has a good chin, but he is a guy who does get hit on occasion. You know, he does get a little bit gun-ho in fights, and when he fought Rowan Murdoch, for example, he got hit quite a few times in that fight. So I definitely think that Parker needs to be tactful in this fight, needs to be patient, and needs to plan for a long, hard 12 rounds. But if he's able to do that, I favour him to beat Demetrius Andrade on points. So I'm going with Zach Parker to win this fight by a fairly competitive but clear unanimous decision. So going with Parker to win the fight on points. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks for watching, and God bless.